Well, hello and welcome back to the All Saints podcast. I'm here with a very, very dear friend of mine today, Pastor Mark Balthrop of Redeemer Reformed Church in Oklahoma City. Many of you will know that I had the pleasure and privilege of heading up to Oklahoma City a few weeks ago before Christmas, end of 2023, to do a series of talks entitled Family Life in the Real World. And I remarked at the start of those talks that I felt distinctly awkward standing up there while Pastor Mark Balthrop was, so to speak, sitting down there listening, because I would very, very cheerfully sit and listen to Pastor Mark talk about anything at all. And so not quite a condition that I laid down, Mark, of my coming to see you, but one of the hopes that we didn't actually get round to during my time there, but we can do now with the wonders of modern technology. I wanted to sit down with you and just to hear your thoughts on family life, on marriage, and just for our congregation here at All Saints and the others who tune into us occasionally here, just to get to know you and your ministry and hear a bit about your family and so on. So, Mark, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's always great to see you for any reason, but glad to be here and your visit to the church. It made a lasting difference. We did a Friday evening and a Saturday morning, and then preaching on a Sunday morning, and people are still talking about it. I still get questions. It really engaged. Sometimes it's good to have, someone from somewhere else. There's a little more credibility there sometimes, but it was excellent and it's highly appreciated.
Well, that's great. I'm really glad. It was a pleasure to be there. And it's interesting. I know you're joking about the credibility point, but I sometimes wonder whether there isn't something behind that, and it's that sometimes the prescriptions, if that's the right word for them, for healthy marriages and healthy family lives, they're not actually that complicated to articulate. They're hard to do. And if you hear 3 or 4 different people saying the same blindingly obvious thing, eventually you start to realize, oh yeah, that I'm starting to see it now. You almost need to hear it in different words, right? It's not that it's super complicated. It's that it can be difficult. It's a long-term task of being a great wife, husband, father, mother.
Yeah, I get wary of people with the secret key, secret knowledge.
Right.
Come to my seminar, and
all your marriage problems will be solved.
All the women will be strong. All the men will be good looking, and all the children will be above average.
Right. Well, look, I'd love to. Let's just jump straight in and tell us a little bit about yourself, your wife, Kristen. You've got 3 children. Just give us a quick sketch of your family life.
We met in church 29 years ago. We've been married 28 years, and had a wonderful marriage all the way through. We both came from families who were in church. So we heard a lot about family. I would say maybe not all of it was great, but it definitely was something you needed to think about. It was something that was a priority in life. And then we have 3 children, 2 in college and 1 senior in high school. Maggie is at the University of Oklahoma. Levi is at Oklahoma State University. And Betsy is coming along to also go to college next year. So that's what our family looks like. We've lived in a few places for churches. We've lived in Texas and Georgia and Florida. But we've been back in Oklahoma, where Kristen and I grew up. We've been back in Oklahoma about 20 years, and at Redeemer about a little over 15, nearly 16 years.
Mm-hmm. And I want to, before we just jump into the stuff about marriage and family life, I did want to make a comment about music, because you yourself are, I would say, pretty musical. Your church, the Sunday I happened to be there, there was a really quite wonderful array of musicians, and it'll be wrong to think we go to church to hear the music, but the music was beautiful. And tell us a little bit about your own musical past and what you think that's done for you or to you as a pastor.
I grew up in rural Oklahoma, and my parents were not musicians, but in a rural school, I was in band. I was a trumpet player. Before that, I loved music at church, and as a young boy, maybe 5, 6 years old, I remember with great trepidation approaching the pianist, the church pianist, and saying, I would like to learn to play the piano. And she said, well, let's get you some lessons. And so when I was in the third grade, 8 years old, I started taking piano lessons. And I just loved it, immediately loved it. When we would go on family vacation and I couldn't play, I looked forward to getting home and playing.
Right.
I started playing the trumpet in the 6th grade, and I just loved music, especially music at church, and went on to major in music for a bachelor degree in music. I wouldn't actually recommend it, but it gave me a great deal of enjoyment. It taught me an appreciation for beauty that I might not have gotten in another way. It's helped me appreciate books and art, and these, because you're necessarily around those things in music. Probably most of all, it taught me the discipline of going in by myself and working long hours while my friends were outside doing other things that I might rather have been doing in a different world, and then emerging and presenting what you'd worked on. And that has been a part of preaching and teaching too. It served me in the church in that I think we ought to have better music. That it ought to be the place of the best music in church. And so the day you were there, I think that was All Saints Sunday, even that day. Yeah. And so there's some big hymns that we do on All Saints Sunday, For All the Saints being one, and you need some brass and organ with that. So that's it's something of a hobby in a way, or it's an enjoyment. It's not really my job, but I love working with our organist and putting those things together. It's also served me in teaching the congregation new psalms and hymns. I'm very, very thankful for it, although I would not maybe recommend that my children do a college degree in music.
Right. Well, let's jump into this topic then of family life in the real world. It was a title that we hit upon in the months before I actually headed up to Oklahoma. I'll sketch out the talks that I gave, just a very brief as I can kind of outline. And then I wonder Mark, if you want to jump in and say, were there any particular parts that you think it would be helpful just to talk about or to explore a bit more, or anything that you thought, oh yeah, that's something I've not heard or that the congregation found helpful? So I began with, again, fairly ordinary and familiar to many people, a biblical framework for family life. Another way of talking about it is a covenant theology of the place of family in God's purposes for the world. And it turns out that marriage is more than just, if just is the right word, a picture of the relationship of the Lord with his people, though it is that, hence all the stuff in the prophets and also, of course, Ephesians 5. It is also marriage, and therefore family is a primary domain within which the promises of God to the world are fulfilled, as God shows grace to his people and his people's children. And so it's quite hard to overstate the significance of faithfulness in family life as what God is doing in us in order to bring about his purposes. Maybe that's the best way of putting it. And so it was a kind of the first talk, and I should say all the talks are available if you wanted to listen to them. They're available on the media section of our church website, allsaintscirc.com/media. And there's an outline there of each of them. But that kind of theological picture was right there in the first talk. Second talk, I talked about submission, which is one of the buzzwords, I guess, that is heard in our circles about the relationship between husbands and wives and how that might be misunderstood and how we can orient ourselves rightly to it. So that both men and women have a role in taking dominion in fulfillment of Genesis chapter 1, and at the same time, God has ordered marriage so that there is an asymmetry there, and husbands have responsibility for leadership in marriage of various kinds. And then we talked about the various ways in which it can go wrong. And of course, it's once you think about it, if husbands and wives have particular and distinct God-given character, they're going to have particular and distinct particular and distinct temptations for those things when they go wrong. And Genesis 3 is a kind of a portrait of everything that could possibly go wrong in marriage, or much of it. Then the third talk, I wanted to spend some time in the book of Ruth, because it seems to me that Ruth and Boaz present a wonderful picture of both the outworking of what I was talking about in the first session. You got a faithful man and a faithful woman coming at the task of marriage with every natural disadvantage. A refugee woman and an older man in a culture that is God-hating to a terrible degree. And yet you see through their quiet faithfulness, you see a faithful dynasty being formed. And 3 generations later, you have the birth of King David. And then finally, I took aim at a fad in modern family life. This is one of the latest of the things that will probably make your eyes roll to think about it again, Mark, of the quick fixes for difficult children, the fad of so-called gentle parenting. And so I segued from just describing that to trying to think more biblically about how we should reflect on and put into practice discipline of our kids. And so, that was the shape of the overall thing. And then also on the website, there's the sermon that I gave the next day. Actually, that sermon was connected with the theme of the talks in the sense, well, the title was Postmillennial Spirituality, which some of our friends here at All Saints will have heard me talk about. But it reflects the conviction that our post-mill theology, the expectation that in the long term, for the long haul, Christ's kingdom will grow with ups and downs for many, many generations till the earth is full of the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. That theological conviction ought to shape our temperament, because it's a long-term vision, and so we should be ready to dig in for the long haul. And so that was the sermon from Acts 1. And then we had a Q&A in which I certainly felt inspired by some of the really good questions, and so some of that. So just for the benefit of our listeners, that was the shape roughly of what I talked about. And I'd love to hear, Mark, if there were particular things that you think your congregation was struck by. Maybe we could dig into some of those.
Yeah, I mentioned the sort of 3 things, then we can talk about them. The first one was in thinking about family as constructed that we see in Scripture, being part of God's blessing to the world, was an eye-opener for a number of our people. There's a lot of the discussion. We, frankly, get a lot of people who grew up with a Baptistic mindset. And then when they come and they begin to think, learn to think covenantally, it's often applied to baptism and how old the children are when we baptize them, that sort of thing. But not in terms of thinking that the family, as the Lord has constructed it, is a gift to the world. It is part of the way that He is redeeming the world, and so that's gold for a family who's maybe hearing, who knows what they're hearing. There's so many different marriage things and family things and what it should be, but very few people are saying, you doing this way is God's gift to the world, and Christ is taking dominion via your family. And somebody told me that there had an argument. A husband and wife had an argument, and somebody said, are we acting as royal people who are part of the Christ taking dominion over the world? And there's like, we felt so stupid about our argument. It's like, what? We're so petty. Like, there's these grand things that are going on. That was a big one.
Right.
A second one was a lot of mention, and it's connected, of course, about the gentle parenting. We're dealing with some generational values that go along maybe with younger parents there, and we, you see that the ebb and flow from generation to generation about how we're going to train children and those sorts of things, and what is loving. We've got a lot of people who believe that loving is gentle. And by gentle, we mean sometimes kind of wild. Decorum and orderliness being thought of as negative,
Right.
and free range being sort of positive. But then when the way you brought it out, Steve, was in terms of, first of all, just maturity and Christian maturity. Jesus himself grew in maturity. He learned obedience through what he suffered. And we all know that. Most Christians know that about their lives. They say, look, some of the most greatest growth and things that I appreciate were actually when I came through hard times. Well, to what end? Well, the crown of life. That's what mature. That's what steadfastness leads us to. And so then training our children and just the ways we relate with our children in those ways to help them mature. And it's often through suffering. That is the way most of us mature, and that leading to the crown of life, and thus a family that is a blessing to the world. That was, I like to use the phrase, that was worth the price of admission right there. Even if there was nothing else, that was it. And then the third thing, and I will say that this has probably gotten more discussion, more continued discussion among us, is from your sermon on postmillennial spirituality. It was like as if an enormous light bulb, like those light bulbs that that they shine up into the sky, and move around. But it was that big of a light bulb to think, wait, my everyday attitude actually is completely opposed to the positivity of my eschatological outlook, which is that Christ is taking dominion and the world is already a far, far better place than it was 100 years ago or 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago because of the influence of Christ and his kingdom in the world. And then I'm just griping and complaining about every little thing. What is the matter with me?
Right.
I repent. So that has really gotten traction among our congregation.
Well, look, I really appreciate that, and I do want to say the congregation was really delightfully engaged, and the Q&A particularly revealed that. Maybe we pick up on that third point before jumping back to the first couple. I've been reflecting on this on and off for years. It was a friend of mine who I've mentioned in many contexts before, David Field, from whom I first heard the phrase post-mill spirituality. And it just captured in my mind something along the lines of what you're suggesting the congregation experienced. It was like a light bulb flicked on. I hadn't realized how much I was neglecting the personal and temperamental correlate of my theology. And so I guess what I'd done was I'd gone from being a sort of default amillennial British Calvinist evangelical to being presuppositional, sort of one form or other of theonomic and post-mill. and extremely angry and frustrated with the carnage and it's not that the anger leaked out all the time, but when I thought about, let's say, contemporary politics, it used to frustrate me immensely, and I think with some reason. And it's not that attitude can't be understood, but most of our misplaced or misguided attitudes can be understood. They can be accounted for. And in my mind, it was this realization that maybe this one theological connection worth probing is that the importance of multi-generational patience. So if Christ is going to take multiple generations to accomplish his purposes, I need to deal with that emotionally. And it's quite hard to do in a context where we are used to quick fixes, or we're used to having some kind of influence. And we're sold this picture of being able to influence the world all the time. And especially in an election year, I was remarking on this last Sunday, it will be extremely easy for us to have biblical aspirations, but worldly demeanor. And of course, what then happens is that anything that is going to take a long time to produce fruit, like being a great parent, just doesn't have the emotional traction. And so if we can reorient ourselves, if we can think, I'm playing not a game, but if it were a game, it's a 1,000-year game. And my contribution to it will be measured by if I'm married with children, by the faithfulness of my great-grandchildren. That at least begins to start helping us to think differently, doesn't it, about the daily practicalities of life.
It does. Your mention of generations and number of generations, that also has been mentioned a number of times. It gave an outlook throughout history that you just don't hear that very many places.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that was helpful. As I said, I've remarked on that here. I think to the extent that everything's connected to everything else, the way that we think about our civil government and the election process in the coming months is going to reflect something of our spirituality. It will tell the world, and it will reflect to each other what we think is really important. And we all know, if you asked us what matters most, the way that you raise your son and daughter, or the particular flavor of political expediency that finds itself in the White House in November, what matters most in God's purposes, we all know the answer. And it's about conforming our daily actions to that reality. So,
absolutely.
Do you want to talk about gentle parenting?
Sure.
So tell us a little bit. I mean, I use the phrase taken from some marketing and PR-oriented Christian discipleship stuff, and actually secular, mostly non-Christian parenting resources. Somehow found their way into the Christian world. Tell us where you've encountered this or something like it, and what it looks like on the ground.
I think sometimes, at least in my experience, when you have people that are looking for what might be considered by some an alternative education, a home or a private school situation, that's not alternative in our circles, but it is alternative in the broader culture. And that is influencing us. That's influencing our people. It's okay. We're not going to have kids sit in a classroom for 7 hours a day. They can really do everything they need to do in 2 hours. And that the real learning happens playing outside in the dirt or something like that. And I grew up in the country, and I appreciate my years in the dirt and in the woods. But it sometimes gets translated then into just let them go, just let them run, let them do their thing, they'll be okay. And that is again, that is loving. That is the loving way. Let the kids be kids. I understand that, and there is certainly people that are, children are to be seen and never heard, sort of thing like that. There's a problem, and you may want to come against that. But we have seen that when we do discipline our children and we expect them to show respect by their behavior to others, maybe older members of the congregation whose mobility is not the same, they don't need children running by them at breakneck speeds in the parking lot or something like that.
For example,
let's curb some of this behavior. But what also goes with that is that we do not expect the children to be seen and not heard. We expect the children to be talked to by adults in real conversation. So there is a good place for kids. When I ask my own kids, coming home from church, I'll say, who do you really like, or who do you feel close to, or something like that at church? And they'll name off, and it's usually a seemingly unrelated, disparate group of people they'll name out. And so I'll say, well, why? The answer is so simple. They talk to me. They take a time in the hallway or at a table, at a meal or something to talk to the children. And so that's a different kind of parenting than okay, we're just going to let the kids run this way and that and so on. It's like, no, we're going to show respect for others through our behavior, but we're also going to engage those children in conversation and things they like to talk about, those sorts of things. And we find that has to go together. It's not keep them under control and quiet.
Yeah, and out of my way.
Let them run and scream. It's like, let's work on our behavior and let's have conversations.
Yeah, because it's fascinating, isn't it? In our liturgical life as a communion in the CREC, we have embraced family inclusive worship, let's say that. Everyone is worshiping together. And one way of framing this is to say, yes, and that is supposed to exemplify the whole of our lives. And therefore, let's have age-integrated relationships as well. And the healthiness of course, the teenagers want to talk to other teenagers, but go and talk to somebody else as well sometimes. And then for the adults to do the same. It's a real joy to me to have, being a pastor and having kids growing up, I guess, they get used to having adults around the place, but it's been a real blessing for us, Nicole and me, as parents, to see our kids blessed by interaction with older people as when they were younger. And that's right. You want to have that kind of texture in relationships in the church. It supports the task of parenting indirectly, doesn't it? Because you end up then with, it's not just I'm the only adult they ever have to listen to. They learn to relate to other adults in a more dynamic and textured way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm even a little bit surprised sometimes just at the level of the quality of the conversation that a 13-year-old can have with a 65-year-old.
Yes, yeah. And encouraging that is, it makes me want to something else, another thought entered my head then. So, something else you said, just going back a step or two to education, seems to me worth probing a little bit more just before I lose the thought completely. The tendency to make decisions about education in reaction to things being done badly. So, for example, the 7 hours a day of being droned at by a bored and boring math teacher is nobody's idea of what education ought to be. And so the temptation to swing to some other kind of extreme with, you used the phrase at one point, maybe in this conversation or a previous one, free-range parenting or free-range education. I wonder if there's a couple of other things going on there. Let me give you a couple of thoughts and tell me what you think. And the first is, I think we've got to acknowledge that actually educating kids is really hard work. Like, yes, teaching them to read, teaching them foreign languages, teaching them math and science is really difficult. Whereas placing in front of them a pile of books and encouraging them to read them, and then encouraging them to run around in the garden and play in the dirt is not so difficult. It's not so demanding on the parents in some ways. And here's the difficulty. They will learn an immense amount from those things. You place the entire corpus of Charlotte Bronte and all the great writers of English novels, Pride and Prejudice and Wuthering Heights and Emma and all these things. I can think of teenage girls not too far away from our home who would just happily have sat for hours and hours and hours devouring that stuff and loved it. But part of me wants to say, hold on, math and science and the harder subjects to teach, Latin and Greek and even Hebrew, are also the fruits of God's work in the world. That don't we want to encourage our children to take dominion there, so to speak, intellectually? And I wonder if those two factors go hand in hand. The first is just educating children is hard, and so there is a temptation to stick with something that does some good rather than the best things which would be harder and do more good. And then there's just the neglect of the recognition of God's work in those other domains.
We were when Chris and I were younger and children were first coming, we had all the answers about education and what we wanted to do, and we knew what to do. It was not very long into that we started realizing, oh, wait, our own self-discipline is being played out in this educational setting, and we may not like what we see about ourselves in this, that the magic bullet is not, oh, we're not going to send you to the public school. Right. There's no magic bullet in homeschooling if there's not a good deal of personal discipline on the part of the parent. It's much harder work to educate your children than to hand them off to someone else.
Yes.
And that was strange. To me, it makes so much sense now, but it was actually a realization for us that we had after getting into it.
Yes, I think that's a story that probably could be told a number of different times in different parts of our particular reformed world, that the priority of saving children from the negative effects of secular education has become so significant that it's as though that's the only thing. And if you've just done that, then you're good, and you're not. There's just a lot more to it than that.
There is, and the children's just behavior, the way they conduct themselves, is a part of their education. And you're hamstringing your children terribly if they are not learning that self-discipline of reading and writing, of thinking these things through, of regimented math work, and all these things. Education is discipline.
Yes. It strikes me as one of the benefits of some kind of collaboration. I guess this isn't the place to talk about the real granular details of what precise structures are helpful for education, but let's at least recognize that if you're educating entirely alone, you have no touchstones outside of your own immediate family circle to either say, look, I think maybe you're pushing them a little hard, 10 hours a day of Greek is probably a little over the top, or to encourage you to step up. And we found this in England, actually. We didn't want to follow the so-called national curriculum in England. There is a curriculum which all government-funded schools have to follow. We didn't want to follow that, but we did keep an eye on it. And the reason we did was because we wanted to make sure that we were, in the pursuit of a Christ-centered education and a biblical education, we weren't just skipping out the hard stuff, which for us, actually, my background before becoming a pastor was in physics, Nicole's was in engineering. For us, the hard stuff would have been like history and English literature and so on. It would have been very much easier for us to major on the things where we felt at home. And we found it helpful to have some kind of external touchstone to say, look, if they manage, even in the government schools, they manage this, we ought to be able to get somewhere near that level. The discipline point prompts another question. Do you think parents sometimes get discouraged when they, their first 2-year-old tantrum episodes start becoming more regular, and they try doing what they think they heard some pastor say sometime about some form of well-defined and strict discipline, and it's not working, quote unquote? Do you think that's a phenomenon that we might helpfully address?
Sure. I encourage people will come to me in the congregation with their children's whatever's worrying them about their children, and of course I can talk about that, but I try to connect them with families who have children a little ahead in that, because there is help. If your 2-year-old is having this tantrum, there is help there. That's not the end of the story. That's just where you are in this chapter. And it's very helpful to not be isolated in those things. I see that as a pastoral job, our pastoral responsibility to help that be together, and to realize that a 2-year-old's tantrum will, for most people, become more moderated. But if it's not dealt with, it will continue throughout their life. It's just not as obvious. And no one wants that for their child.
Right.
So we're not going to give up on them. We're not going to say, well, you just got to let the kids be kids, and sometimes they have tantrums. Those are opportunities. You have opportunities in there. You have opportunities to connect with other people in the church and get help for those things, and actually see, strangely enough, I wouldn't probably say to a mother who's just dealt with a 2-year-old last hour, well, that tantrum will be good for you and your children. Okay, so maybe it's not the time to hear it. The truth is, if we can deal with those tantrums when hearts are still tender, before the concrete has set up, then we will have done not only a lifetime of value, given a lifetime of value to the child, but to the church and to the world.
Yeah.
And so we try to see those things. That it is a natural part of human development to have tantrums.
Yeah. I think that's
part of maturity. Is the impetus that is giving rise to that is to work with it better.
Yeah. I think that's such a helpful thing, to introduce the idea of growing to maturity into that context. So what's happening when a child grows up is that they're developing new physical and emotional and cognitive faculties, and any new faculty will be affected by sin. We're the Calvinists, right? We understand total depravity in the sense of the extent of our lives which are negatively affected by sin is total. And so, of course, we should expect our children, when they start to speak, to use their words unkindly from time to time. Sure. It's just normal. And normal in the sense that sin is normal, therefore not acceptable, and not something we give into. And so here what happens is our doctrine of the victory of Christ in history, our eschatology, in other words, our postmillennialism, filters into our family life. We expect, just as we expect the through many generations, God to be at work to bless the world through families, we expect within a generation God to be at work to bless those families so that they will be a blessing to the world. So it won't take 2 days, or maybe even not 2 weeks, but a couple of months maybe. We've had times ourselves, and maybe you could tell, I'm sure you could tell stories as well, of periods when it felt like there's no end to this, whatever it is. I don't want to embarrass my kids. I embarrass them enough. But there is an end to it with diligent and prayerful discipleship of our kids. There's an end to the problem, and then the beginning of the next one, and the cycle continues. So,
well, someone said to me after the week after you had given the conference, they said, I got to thinking that living such good lives among the pagans that they glorify God in the day that he visits us is not just kind of an individual, I don't know, sexual ethics or financial ethics or something like that. That happens in the family. We would want sort of almost in an Advent theme, we want to make straight the path of the Lord by the way we conduct our families. I was thrilled to
yes
been a part of that conversation.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, I'm encouraged here at All Saints. We, like you, we keep our kids in the worship service with us, and from time to time there are squawks and so on, and mostly parents are pretty diligent, and if there's a squawk that goes on for more than a few seconds, or it's more than a certain decibel level, the child will be escorted out. And I just want to give a huge high five or a big hug to those mums and dads who are doing that, because I want to say, look, if this is just part of the stage of life you're at, and God bless you for doing it, and you have this opportunity in the church community to sit down with your son in a room of 50 yards away from the sanctuary, wherever you can get to, just to say, listen, son, this is not acceptable. There's administration of some appropriate discipline, and then a hug and a prayer, and then okay, we're going to go back into worship, and you're going to sit quietly. This is not how we behave here. And it's great. It's hard. And what's interesting is a congregation gets to a certain size, and there will always be one or two children who are going through a turbulent few weeks, and so we want to be at one and the same time encouraging the parents to be diligent about that, and then I want to say highly tolerant of the minor disruptions occasioned thereby. If oh my goodness, I have to get out of the way while Mr. Smith takes little Johnny out again, fine, pray for him as he squeezes past you, because that liturgical context then can become a microcosm of the lives of those families.
That's right. I had someone say to me in frustration about some of their child rearing, said, I feel so bad. I used to listen to R.C. Sproul, and he would always say, "Right now counts forever." That was sort of the subline of the Table Talk magazine. Right now counts forever. And my child's doing this and whatever. I said, look, right now might count forever, but right now is not forever. Right now is an opportunity to make sure this isn't forever.
Yeah. The final point, which was the first you mentioned, the family is part of God's blessing to the world. So what are we doing here? We're connecting a practical theology of family life with covenant theology and eschatology and the Great Commission and the cultural mandate. It's God's plan is that all the nations would see, that all the nations would hear. And the way that's done tracks back through those theological structures to how Mrs. Smith and Mr. Smith prayerfully are seeking to love one another and honor one another in marriage and to raise children who know and love the Lord. And do you want to say a word or two about that, or lest I wax lyrical for too long?
There is I mentioned we do have a lot of people who are going through a theological shift, or which we're all going through theological shifts all of our lives. But some of the bigger ones happen sometimes as young adults. And so we have people like that. And so it's like, okay, how does the covenant apply to old world, new world? How does the covenant apply to sacraments? That, of course, is a big one, especially baptism. But then not really hasn't been a lot of thought for some folks yet on, well, how does covenant apply to the family? And what is happening in the family and in the way we work with the children, and what does small faithfulness mean? Does small faithfulness matter? And that's where your wonderful Ruth imagery came in. It's like, well, they were an unlikely couple,
yes,
in an unlikely place at an unlikely time. But then there was Obed, Jesse, and David, just like that. Small faithfulness with the family, even in the midst of a whole world who really is not there to help you with covenantal family life. But you can do this, and it's full of hope. I mean, it's truly full of hope what the Lord may do. You may get to see it in your life. You may not get to see it in your life. You may get to see some, but undoubtedly you'll probably see some, but you won't see it all. But that gives you great hope, and that hope is that pathway to the hard things and to the discipline that it takes. Because I don't know anybody that would say that they didn't want an Obed, Jesse, David to come out of their family. Everyone would want that, right? Well, how did that happen? It was unspectacular in many ways in the book of Ruth, but it is quite spectacular now.
Yeah. It makes me want to say a word or two about marriage specifically as distinct from parenting, because the thought strikes me that with the growth of our churches and the growth of our communion, we are blessed with a whole range of different people coming to us from a whole range of different backgrounds. And as a pastor, I wouldn't say frequently, but it's not infrequent that I'll hear people saying, without wanting to be disrespectful or ungrateful for their own parents and their own upbringing, they are starting to perceive things that their own mums and dads would acknowledge were lacking in their upbringing. Their parents who were well-meaning, perhaps, but immature in the faith, or perhaps not Christians, or perhaps struggled in various ways with issues related to substance abuse or any number of other things. And I guess an aspect of the lives of Ruth and Boaz that speaks to that situation is just to consider where they came from and what God made them. I mean, Boaz, the text says Boaz came from Bethlehem. Now, we don't know about his parents, but boy, do we know about his culture. He was from a depraved and wicked city. And it's an astonishing surprise to see the positive impact he'd had on the men who worked for him. And so he is a picture of the change, or rather, at the very least, the godliness and the faithfulness that God's Spirit can produce in a man who certainly lacked some of the cultural and ecclesial advantages that we have. And Ruth, the same. She comes from Moab. She'd been introduced, I guess, to the family of Naomi and Elimelech, but only as a young woman or an adult. how many years had she had worshipping idols in the land of Moab, and God worked in her to turn her into the most remarkable picture of Christian faithfulness, or believing faithfulness, I suppose we should say, in that Old Testament context. And I guess I want to say that too. There's a kind of Christian husband or wife who feels like I could never be that kind of godly wife, that kind of godly husband, because, and then they point to something in their past. And I want to say, really? I don't buy that. I'm not buying that implied limit on the grace of God's Spirit. And I've now been here in the US long enough to see it here. I'd certainly seen it during my time as a pastor in the UK, but I've been here now 3 and a bit years. And that's the kind of time scale. When you see a Christian man or Christian woman she goes from this dawning self-realization towards a process of seeking disciplined growth in godliness, that's the kind of time scale that we see God working on. And I want to encourage people to keep prayerfully striving for that kind of faithfulness.
Yeah, I agree. This is not always a comfortable topic for everybody in our circles sometimes, but I am convinced that early childhood trauma is something that we deal with a lot, and you may know about like an ACE score, adverse childhood experiences score, and we get people at our church who we don't give an ACE score test, but I know it's quite high. I mean, they've been through a great deal in their lives. I did not. I grew up in a pretty healthy situation. But those traumas do leave a mark on your life. And the secular world has recognized that and really tries to offer some therapy to it. I'm not knocking it, but I haven't seen that therapy make a huge difference. But what I have seen are people who must have had pretty high ACE scores, like Ruth and Boaz and Naomi.
Correct.
I have seen people that in the context of marriage and church, they are able to make sure that those early childhood experiences and traumas, and sometimes it's generation to generation, do not get to have the last word in their life. Those experiences are actually brought to an end. They are multi-generational ways of relating, and they stop with Christian families who are pursuing doing the family in those simple ways that we mentioned at the beginning, quite simple, by doing those with the support of the church. It's the greatest therapy that I know.
Yes.
And when I look at it, just think of all the details about Ruth and Boaz we don't know.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
That they must have gone through. And I see it. I've seen it now. I've been ordained for 23 years. I have seen it again and again, that there is real help and recovery for the things that people have been through, but there's no instant fix. It's becoming part of the covenant community, living with a covenantal mindset, and perhaps a postmillennial spirituality that heals and brings an end to some pretty dreadful things that the fall has brought to us.
Pastor Mark Balthrop from Redeemer Church in Oklahoma City, thank you very much indeed for being on the All Saints podcast.
Thank you. It's wonderful.
The Lord bless you guys. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And we'll see you next time. Bye for now.